Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to our webinar today. I just wanted to give everybody a warm welcome. We're really excited to start with our panelists in just a moment. I just wanted to tell everybody that this webinar has been organized by the American Friends of SOAS. We are a nonprofit organization founded by SOAS alumni in the United States, and our aim is to develop rich relationships between SOAS alumni in the United States with SOAS in the United Kingdom, and promoting all of the educational aims and the study of Africa, Asia, and the Middle East, and supporting projects here and relationships with our fellow SOAS alum in the UK and elsewhere. I'm going to turn it over to my co-host, Shireen, who's going to introduce our moderator.
Hi, everyone. We're very excited for this very timely event. My name is Shireen Nassar. I sit on the board of the American Friends of SOAS as the Boston rep, and I'm very excited to introduce Rabia Akhbari. He is a doctoral candidate at Harvard Law School, and he also is a former attorney with Adalah in Palestine. So I'll turn it over to Rabia to take it from here.
Thank you, Shireen, and thank you, everybody, for joining us today. We're just gonna jump right straight into our topics and discuss. We're gonna have a very fruitful and interesting set of debates or conversation. I'm really excited about that. So our title today is Israel-Palestine, the shift in Western sentiment and the way forward. And as many of you have perhaps heard in the news or elsewhere, and the rest since since last May, basically, there has been a very strong escalation in violence in Palestine. This started in Jerusalem, around Sheikh Jarrah, escalated into, or shifted also into the 48 Palestinians. I'll just say, if everybody can just mute themselves so that we won't have to mute you. It started with Sheikh Jarrah, with the pending forced evictions of the residents of certain Palestinian families in Sheikh Jarrah. The case is still pending in the Supreme Court right now, and Israel has tried to depict it as a real estate dispute. Obviously, as we'll hear more from the participants today, this is, or as I have also said, at least I can say in my name, I think that using the framework of real estate dispute is just one method that we should be reminded of, that this is part of the methods that people are ethnically cleansed. So these are not necessarily a clashing arguments, but we'll hear more about that in a bit. Then Gaza joined the picture, and 48 Palestinians and the West Bank, and it all evolved as also has been shared a lot in social media platforms, and with the presence, very strong presence of Palestinians in mainstream media, perhaps for the first time. So we're definitely witnessing certain or some change, arguably, that has put the discourse around Palestine and framed it in different light, shed a light on what's going on in Palestine. We've been more familiar with terms like settler colonialism, apartheid, that have been invoked more recently in the discourse around Palestine in mainstream media. And we have seen certain backlash to these Palestinian voices and pro-Palestinian voices, not only Palestinians. We have seen also many accusations of trying to silence Palestinian voices under the pretext of anti-Semitism. And this is an important point, which I should at least say in my name, that I think this is one of the, as a person who moved from Palestine to the US, I've really been shocked to see how the discourse changes from the way that even Israelis talk with Palestinians or around Palestinian issues, and the way that in Western discourses this unfolds. And the charges of anti-Semitism are many times levied against Palestinians to silence them, regardless of the real intentions behind it, or the criticism of Israel is translated into a charge of anti-Semitism automatically, which we should be talking about during our event today. So we'll start with opening remarks from our speakers. I'm really excited to introduce our speakers. We'll start with Professor Gilbert Ashar, who grew up in Lebanon, researched and taught in Beirut, Paris, and Berlin, and has been Professor of Development Studies and International Relations at SOAS. University of London since 2007. He's the author of several books published in over 15 languages, including The Clash of Barbarism, The Making of the New World Disorder, Peerless Power, the Middle East and the US Foreign Policy, co-authored with Noam Chomsky. The Arabs and the Holocaust, the Arab-Israeli War of Narratives, and the People Want a Radical Exploration of the Arab Spring. So we'll start with Professor Gilbert Ashar, who will be opening our discussion today. Then we'll move forward to the next panelist intervention, then open it up for questions.
So, thank you very much, Rabia, and many thanks to the organizers for assembling this wonderful panel. I'm very happy to share this panel with all of you, and with Nadia and Peter in particular, with Rabia as moderator. So that's a great opportunity. In 5 minutes about our general topic, I would start by saying that what is called in the title the Western shift, or the shift in the Western opinion, is probably the view you may have from the United States, because I believe that if there is a shift, it's mostly in the United States as a recent shift. You know, I don't sense the same kind of shift having happened recently in Europe, whether in Britain, where I'm usually based, or in Germany, from where I'm speaking right now. So I think the image of the shift, the idea of the shift, which is a reality actually, is a much more one about the US, where you have a number of surveys and polls having been taken in very recent time, including one right after the last May events, last month. You had a poll also confirming a shift in part in a major segment of the US public opinion, especially among the youth and among, of course, those who define themselves as liberals, among the ethnic minorities in the United States, and all that. There you have very, very clearly a shift that has occurred over just the very few recent years. If you look at the polls, you can see a shift, for instance, between what happened until 2014 and what happened since 2014. And the war on Gaza in 2014 is probably the first event where you start having a majority of the young people blaming Israel more than those, in proportion, more than those blaming Hezbollah or Hamas or whichever organization is involved. So having said that, I think there is indeed a general trend which I would attribute to 3 factors. And it so happens that I've written a piece on exactly this topic, which will come out in Catalyst soon, as part of a dossier on this issue that we are discussing today, was the participation of Noam Chomsky and Rashid Khalidi discussing the same issue. So I would say that, in my view, the general shift is attributable to 3 factors. The first being the long-term deterioration or change in Israel's image. If we look at Israel's image from the first decades following the creation of the Israeli state into what it has become today, you see a huge shift in the perception of the Israeli state, which corresponds, of course, to a change in the Israeli state itself. That includes, for instance, the arrival of Likud, the far right of the Zionist movement, to government, to power in 1977, the first time they won the election. And since 1977, they have been at the helm of the Israeli government for the more than 2/3 of the time. Yeah, they have been the overwhelming now force in Israeli politics, even though they just lost the control of the government very recently. But we all know that how fragile the present situation is anyways. You have had factors like under the Likud, the war on Lebanon, 1982, which was a major factor in changing the perception of the Israeli state. The first war that was obviously not a war of defense and could not really be justified with such a pretext. You had the Intifada and the role of the Israeli state in repressing brutally this popular uprising, which was a non-violent popular uprising, the Intifada of end of 87 and 1988 as the peak. And then you've had the new war on Lebanon, 2006, but the wars on Gaza, given also the disproportion between Gaza, the Gaza Strip, what it is physically or humanly or whatever from every point of view, and the Israeli state and the violence of those onslaughts of Israel on Gaza, I think all these factors, all these events have contributed to a shift in the perception of the Israeli state. Then the second factor, in my view, is the new political polarization that we have been witnessing at the global level since it's been over many years, but it accelerated with the crisis of what was called the Great Recession. That is what started with the subprime crisis in the United States in 2007, 2008. And this accelerated a polarization in politics globally, which also is very clear in the United States with an increasing distance and increasing gap between the two wings, the two traditional wings of US politics. We have seen this very clearly from through the recent decades with the Tea Party under Obama and then the Donald Trump and the rest. And Israel's relation to that has consisted precisely from the same time when you had Obama and the reactions, the right-wing reaction to Obama in the United States that started 2009. It's when Netanyahu comes to power in Israel. And then you have this kind of parallel through which Netanyahu will go further than any previous prime minister in the history of Israel in interfering in US politics and taking a side, very clear side with the Republicans against the Obama administration. So to the point that that was, of course, that culminated with the full identification between Donald Trump, what he represented, and Netanyahu, the full complicity, the full collusion between the two. And that, of course, was a major factor in alienating Israel to this whole constituency that is anti-Trump in the United States, which is, as we know, very, very big, with the very sharp division in the US public opinion and polity in general. And the third factor is more specific to the United States, although it has global repercussions. It's the Black Lives Matter movement, and especially the peak with in reacting to the murder of George Floyd. The fact that this has been a major component of the new youth radicalization that we have witnessed in the United States, I think this has also contributed a lot to what the polls indicate as a shift, mostly among the youth, those under 30 years of age, between 18 and 30. And that's where the polls see a real shift in becoming increasingly critical of the Israeli state. And of course, this translated to a certain degree, not fully, but to a certain degree in the political institutions, in the new Congress, among Democrats, where you have more and more voices daring to be critical of Israel or daring to ask for strings to be attached, for instance, at the very least, to the US aid to Israel. So these are the factors that I see as the main explanation, as I would put it, to this phenomenon that we are discussing today.
Thank you so much, Gilbert. We'll be back and discussing these factors perhaps more broadly in our questions that we will be discussing after the opening remarks. So just pinning that for a second, so we'll be back to that for sure. Nadia will go on with you. Dr. Nadia Nasser Najab has a PhD in Middle East Studies and is a lecturer in Palestine Studies at the European Center of Palestine Studies, Institute of Arab and Islamic Studies at the University of Exeter. She is the author of Dialogue in Palestine, the People-to-People Diplomacy Program, and the Israeli-Palestinian Conflict. She formerly taught European Civilization at Birzeit University. I'm really delighted you're with us, Professor Nasser Najab. I'll give you the floor. I just want to say Happy Eid to everybody who is Eid Mubarak, to everybody who is celebrating. I am here from Palestine in Al-Fahim, where my parents actually are originally, and we can definitely feel the Eid here. So I'm just sharing this with you. Professor Nasser Najab, the floor is yours.
Great. Thank you.
You're muted.
Yeah, thank you very much, and thank you for organizing this event. I'm glad to be with you. Okay, in order to talk about the shift in discourse, I'd like to focus more on Palestinian struggle so that we understand this shift that is happening today, whether it's new or it has been there. Palestinians have always aligned their resistance with broader anti-colonial struggles, and solidarity with Palestinians around the world also, I mean, during this recent events, is not new, but it took different forms with the advanced technologies and social media. During the first Intifada, for example, the unified leadership of the Intifada called for the release of Nelson Mandela and political prisoners around the world. Also, some international groups and organizations during the first Intifada, they decided to boycott Israel. This is way before BDS was established. For example, federal laboratories of Pennsylvania refused to deliver gas to Israel until Israel confirms that it's not going to use it as a weapon. This alignment with broader anti-colonial, anti-racist, anti-imperial struggles empower Palestinians and help them expand their tools and develop new forms, effective forms of resistance. More importantly, it gives them hope, as Angela Davis once talked about this being aligned with international struggle. And protection. I had a conversation with an activist from South Hebron Hills, and he told me how absence of international activists affected Palestinians' resistance and how Israeli violence escalated in the absence of these international solidarity groups in South Hills, Hebron. He told me also that now solidarity groups, Israeli solidarity groups started to come back. Of course, the absences was due to Corona. So, and in his opinion, this helped them a lot and protected them. Although this is not the case in every place in Palestine. I mean, my experience, for example, in the first Intifada, in joint projects, in joint activities with Israelis, they were subject to the same violence as Palestinians during protests. And anyway, so however, following Oslo Agreement, there are two major elements, I believe, played a role in affecting Palestinian struggle. One is related to the impression that there is peace and Palestinians and Israelis are working on resolving the outstanding issues. So peace has been achieved. The second is related to the fragmentation of the land, which is due to the agreement, the nature of the agreement itself. This is coupled, of course, with the internal division. The turning point in Palestinian struggle, I believe, was the second Intifada in 2000. After the second Intifada, as the peace process collapsed and Israel refused to resolve the outstanding issues of Jerusalem, Israeli settlements, and the right of return to Palestinian refugees, I think made a huge impact on Palestinian struggle. So this is when Palestinians started to think of different forms of resistance. And they asked international community to support the resistance, in particular, the post-colonial reality represented in a neoliberal order and apartheid regime. So during this period also, by the way, there's something important. When Palestinians asked Israeli groups that if they want to support Palestinian struggle, then they have to set out a clear political position and recognize full Palestinian rights, including right of return. And some Israeli organizations responded. So what we see now on the ground, Israeli groups who fight with Palestinians on the ground in hotspots like in Sheikh Jarrah, or mostly agree with Palestinians on their full political rights, including right of return. So here I see where the discourse shifted, the meaning of peace shifted. I wouldn't say that, maybe it's too early to say that it shifted against two-state solution, maybe unconscious. What they are fighting for, if they are fighting for full rights, equal rights, then I don't think this fits within the paradigm of the two-state solution. So now, this is when BDS was created or established after the Second Intifada. BDS, as a different form of resistance, I don't only mean that it's a non-violent resistance that calls for boycotting Israel, but the demands also are important. I mean, during the first Intifada, which was popular and successful to a certain extent, the demands were a two-state solution. Mostly, Palestinians, of course, wanted to resolve also the issue of, Palestinians also had in mind right of return and the issue of Jerusalem on all of that. However, it was not spelled out, let's say. I think BDS spelled out or talked about Palestinians inside and outside, wanted to end the occupation for, it's not only about 67, but wanted equal rights for Palestinians in Israel, and of course wanted the right of return to the refugees. So here I feel, that's why I think the Second Intifada was a turning point. Now, of course, in response to that, you can imagine, I mean, Israel wouldn't like it. And that's when Israel started to conflate criticism of Israel and supporting boycott with anti-Semitism. And I tell you from my experience, during our struggle before Oslo, we never heard these terms. I mean, never been accused. I remember we used to even criticize Zionism. It was fine, but things have changed after, and I believe we can talk about this later, about reaction of Israel. But what I want to say is that the shift in discourse also led to shift in Palestinian resistance and how the international community received this shift. Of course, there have been developments, as Professor Ashkar referred to, Black Lives Matter, especially the younger generation, could not be progressive except for Palestine. This term, I mean, they have to resolve the cognitive dissonance. You cannot say, okay, I am against racism here, but I can't say a word about racism there. So I think this also encouraged people to and the images, seeing the images on social media, TikTok, it was like a live news for the world. So they had to make a stand about that. And I will stop here and then we'll answer questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Nadia. Thank you so much for this intervention. We'll move on with Peter, who will be also joining the conversation with opening remarks. Professor Peter Beinart is a professor of journalism and political science at the City University of New York. He's also editor-at-large of Jewish Currents, a CNN political commentator, a frequent contributor to the New York Times, and a non-resident fellow at the Foundation for Middle East Peace. He writes the Beinart Notebook newsletter on Substack.com. Professor Beinart graduated from Yale University, winning a Rhodes Scholarship for Graduate Studies at Oxford University. After graduation, he became the News Republic managing editor in 1995. He became senior editor in 1997, and from 1999 to 2006, served as the magazine's editor. He has published The Good Fight in 2006, The Icarus Syndrome, and The Crisis of Zionism in 2012. Peter, we're happy you're joining us. And I would just say that I've just read a new piece by Peter released, I believe, a couple of days ago in Jewish Currents, which was extremely interesting. I would recommend everybody to read it. Peter, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much. I'm also just going to put in the link a piece I wrote on this subject about what is shifting and what's not shifting in the United States. And forgive me if I repeat a little bit of what's already been said. I think that public discourse in the US is shifting, but it's far from clear that that shift is going to manifest itself in American government policy, at least anytime soon. I think the single biggest reason that American public discourse is shifting, as it was said before, is because the Black Lives Matter movement, and maybe even to some degree the Me Too movement, made people in media much more conscious of questions of representation. So that it used to be normal for it to have conversations about Israel-Palestine, which had no Palestinians. That has become embarrassing to people recently, in the similar way that they've become more embarrassed about the idea of having panels with men that don't include women about issues of concern to women, or issues about concern to Black Americans that don't include Black Americans. This question of representation has become something that people in the mainstream media have become more conscious of, not the right-wing media, but the mainstream media. And so this has meant that we've had many more Palestinian voices in recent months than we did before. When you put Palestinians in front of the camera or give them space in the newspaper, it changes the discourse in pretty substantial ways. It's also the case that because Palestinians in the US were largely excluded from mainstream media, they focused on social media. And the boundaries between social and mainstream media have eroded. Journalists, a lot of them spend most of their time on Twitter. So what they see on social media actually now influences mainstream media much more than it did. And the Palestinian influence on social media is bleeding into American mainstream media. I think it's also the case that Palestinians have been in the United States longer. We have more Palestinians born in the United States. It's less of an immigrant community than it was a generation or two ago. America in general, demographically, has been transformed by the post-1965 immigration. And I think that has been part of the reason that a younger generation of Palestinian activists have been so successful in integrating themselves into the larger left-wing space that you see among younger Americans. It's also the case that because of the dramatic political polarization we've seen in the United States, while there are still plenty of very, very strident pro-Israel voices, those pro-Israel voices are now much more clustered on the right end of the American political spectrum than they were, which means they're not as influential for progressives, which is to say, there used to be a whole series of quite influential and prominent basically kind of pro-Israeli government commentators who had some credibility with progressives. Such figures no longer have the same stature they used to. However, I don't think it's necessary that this shift in media and public discourse and public culture necessarily will shift quickly, or maybe even at all, into US government policy. First of all, the US government has shown that American policy can be highly insulated from American public opinion on a lot of issues. 90% or so of Americans want some kind of gun control legislation. We haven't been able to, it hasn't passed for a decade. Another maybe more relevant example is the example of US policy towards Cuba. Most Americans would support a more open policy towards Cuba. By some polls, even most Cubans would support such a policy. But public opinion does not directly translate into government policy. It's organized interest groups that mobilize people. And that's why gun owners and people who are hawkish on Cuba have a lot more influence than their political opponents, even if they are smaller in number. Among both American Christian conservatives and in a part of the American Jewish community, you have very well organized pro-Israel organizations that have been working very effectively for a long time. You don't have anything like that kind of organization politically, that kind of political heft on the more pro-Palestinian side. Part of, again, even if you look at the Jewish community, let's say the American Jewish community is split roughly 50-50. The people in the American Jewish community who are further left are younger, they have less money, they're less institutionally organized. And this is very critical. And this is true for the left in general. They're more universalistic, which means that they're not as likely to prioritize these issues. So even if there are lots of Americans now who take a progressive pro-Palestinian view, it's not necessarily their first, second, or third voting issue, nor the issue that they're going to, right? They might prioritize climate change or immigration policy or healthcare. So it's easier for politicians to ignore public opinion on an issue when their constituents are not voting on that issue. So even if you look at Black members of Congress, or we know that Black public opinion in the United States tends to lean in a very progressive direction on this. The vast majority of Black politicians in Congress are not particularly progressive on Israel-Palestine. Small number of exceptions, but most are not. And how can they ignore public opinion? Because it's not a primary voting issue for their constituents, and because their constituents are not organized around this issue while other people are. Secondly, American policy has already been insulated. American politics may be growing less democratic, right? We, as I'm sure you all know, are in the midst of a rather large struggle here, really, around big questions like whether people of color in the United States will meaningfully have the vote, to what degree America's kind of democratic system will even remain as minimally democratic it's been. If the left loses that fight, that has very profound implications for the ability of this public shift to translate into government policy on this issue, as with many other things. And the last point I would make is that when one thinks about a kind of progress, it's important to look at the baseline, right? So while one can see some modest progress in the Democratic Party, perhaps from the baseline that we had, 10 years ago or even 5 years ago, there's another party in the United States called the Republican Party, right? In the Republican Party, there is zero support for any pressure on Israel, right? There's basically almost unanimous support for Israel to do virtually whatever it wants. And it's worth remembering that it was a Republican president. The last president who conditioned U.S. aid to Israel was a Republican, George H.W. Bush, during the settlement loan guarantees of the early 1990s. So if you put 1990 as a benchmark, what you see is that the Republican Party has become much less open to any criticism or conditionality of U.S. policy on Israel than it was 30 years ago. So that's not progress. That's actually moving in the opposite direction in one of America's two major political parties. So while I think there is an important shift that's taking place culturally and in the media, it's hard. I'm not at all certain that it will necessarily play itself out inside US government policy, at least in the short term.
Thank you, Peter, for this rich and thought-provoking intervention. I beg to differ in certain points, but perhaps I just want to remain a little bit more optimistic. So we'll move forward. Before that, Nadia, there is two questions for you, very particular ones, before we delve into the more broader conversation. First, there is a question from Tammy who asks, would you please repeat the name of that company in Pennsylvania that withheld gas from Israel?
Yeah, let me answer this. It's Federal Laboratories of Pennsylvania. And it is in particular, it's in a book called Living the Intifada. I sent it to you, I think. I sent it in the chat. But it's Federal Laboratories of Pennsylvania.
Great. And there is one more that pertains, maybe you want to say a word about that, that pertains to whether the Palestinian government recognized Israel's right to exist. If so, who stated this recognition? This is also for you now.
Oh my God, I mean, PLO recognized the right of Israel to exist probably every day they do that. I mean, but Oslo agreement is based on mutual recognition in 1993. So the concept, I mean, Oslo agreement started in 1993 when they exchanged letters of recognition. So PLO recognized Israel's right to exist, and Israel recognized PLO as the representative of Palestinian people. I mean, so I can talk on and on. We can have a whole event on this, but this is what happened, yes. And what was the second part?
No, this was the, these were the two questions. I just want to note on this occasion about, many people ask about whether, Palestinians recognize Israel's right to exist, the PLO, exactly on that point. I just want to say that in the last 20 years following the Second Intifada, after the collapse of the Oslo, the meaningful collapse of the two-state solution since the Second Intifada, what we've been seeing on the ground many times, that we should also remember that Israel recognized the PLO as the legitimate representative of the Palestinian people. And in fact, there was a Palestinian flag during the 90s that was raised in the Israeli government offices during the negotiation. Now, what happens on the ground is that, especially in Jerusalem during the last few years, definitely in the last period with the escalation, that raising the Palestinian flag still can lead to arrest of Palestinians, perhaps not officially under the certain articles. Previously, before the Oslo records, it was actually an offense to raise the Palestinian flag. Today, we see it in many different ways. That also political organizations of Palestinians that Israel actually recognized during the Oslo peace process are still being persecuted. We see this with Khalid Jarrar, who has been under Israeli detention, whether administrative or not. So I'm just noting that because many times people, just take one part of the symmetry of this recognition.
Can I just add that Israel does not allow Palestinian Authority to send letters headed with State of Palestine. It has to be Palestinian Authority. So it does not allow State of Palestine.
Yeah, I mean, this is only part of the Oslo infrastructure, I guess, that is not only fragments the Palestinian people, but also imposes indirect Israeli rule over the Palestinian Authority itself. Anyway, we'll move forward with talking a little bit about exactly what we just opened with, about identifying the change. And here I want to, so we identified perhaps certain parts of the change. Peter, you talked a little bit about that this change doesn't necessarily translate into public policy. We have more recently, and we'll get more into that, seen that there is perhaps translation into private companies that are stepping in and taking more active part, perhaps under the pressure or the shift of the discourse with Ben and Jerry's boycott of the Israeli settlements most recently. But besides that, I want to ask you all, how do you identify this change and how deep it is? Do you think is it a lasting change that we will see accompanying us and building on it? Or is this a momentum that perhaps can fade away? And why now? Gilbert, you addressed this a little bit. You tried to identify the factors that led to this. But do you think that this is something that we're going to see, fading if we don't maintain in a certain way, or is this something that we will be seeing present regardless of what will be done?
Well, very, very quickly, I would say that the basic factors that I tried to summarize very briefly in the introduction are there, and I can't see them changing, or at least not in the immediate or foreseeable future. But we have now a very clear, public relations campaign launched by the new government, and its foreign minister, who's the dominant figure in it in Israel. I mean, I'm speaking of the Israeli government, and the role of Lapid and this attempt at changing the image again, repairing, if you want, what they attribute to Netanyahu, which in part is, of course, due to Netanyahu, but only in part, as we mentioned, the deterioration of Israel's image is not only due to Benjamin Netanyahu, of course. But I mean, I think for the young people, for this new youth radicalization that we have been witnessing in the United States, I think things are there to stay, to remain, and probably to get deeper, because the more people dare to speak loudly about Israel, the more, you know, this will progress. I mean, Peter was very right to emphasize the fact that this does not translate into public policy. And what I mentioned was that at least it is translating, it is beginning to get some echo in the institutions, that starting with the Congress. We have seen more criticism of Israel among the Democrats in the very recent times than we have seen for a very, very, very long time. But now this also remains quite limited. Just take the case of Representative Ilhan Omar and the big fuss made about her statements when she was accused of equating between Hamas and Israel and drawing the so-called moral equivalency. Well, for me, what would be unacceptable is to put Hamas, whatever one thinks of Hamas and Israel, on the same, you know, level of responsibility, of moral responsibility. I mean, for me, if there is a problem of moral equivalency, that would be in not explaining that Israel is the main culprit. Israel is the oppressor of the Palestinian people, and whatever happens on the side of the Palestinian is but a reaction to Israeli oppression, okay? But the criticism in the United States were from the other point of view. That is, how can you equate Israel, you know, with this myth about Israel's democracy and the rest, with Hamas, with the demonization of Hamas, as it has been very, very current. So I think, of course, there's a very long way to go, but we have seen a beginning. And indeed, you're right to be optimistic, or to try to be optimistic. At least there's enough ground for hope. And that means that the struggle pays, the struggle gives results. And Nadia was very right in stressing also the importance of BDS and all these forms of struggle that also Peter mentioned about the emergence of the Palestinian voice from within the United States. And these are factors that are here to stay and to develop. So from that point of view, I think there is space for hope in my perspective.
Yeah, can I add something? I mean, yeah, I mean, I understand why Peter is pessimistic about public policy and so on. But as a Palestinian, I mean, I can't but have hope. And also I've seen some achievements on the ground. What matters at the end of the day is the Palestinian struggle on the ground. I mean, we've seen lately, for example, Beta village near Nablus was able to stop the construction of a settlement. It's due to Palestinian resistance. I understand that, of course, policies of the US and the EU, all of these policies are important to Palestinian struggle. But I think that we impose it rather than, it's a bottom up, rather than that what shall we do with these policies? We have to impose on the US these policies through our struggle and our resistance. And I've seen other achievements also. For example, although it's not radical, but Palestinians and Israeli groups, Israeli peace groups supporting Palestinians in Be'laim, for example, have changed the path of the apartheid wall. At least they managed to achieve this. So, I mean, it's small achievements, but this is what gives us hope and keeps us going.
Peter, if you want to jump in here, I just want to say that I can't agree more, Nadia, with you about the agency of Palestinians here and how important it is to emphasize it. This week, we've seen actually a big report in the Times Magazine about the Al-Kurd twins, Hamad and Mona Al-Kurd, who have become the faces of Sheikh Jarrah and the struggle there. And they really visibilized this struggle for many people, both in Arabic and in English. And it is, Peter, when you talked about, you know, the integration of the factors of the presence of Palestinians in the US, it's also important to understand, I think, what for us Palestinians, at least in the homeland, what happened in May and following May was many times the establishment of links that didn't exist before, or the consolidation of these links that didn't exist before between the Palestinian fragments themselves, between Palestinians in the homeland and Palestinians in the diaspora, and the reach of these conversations into perhaps one conversation finally about Palestine, regardless of territory. So it's important to keep it in mind. If you have any, you know, thoughts about that, or you want to jump in and say.
Sure. So look, I certainly don't want to, I also have hope. I think hope and optimism are two different things. But I certainly have hope. And I think that it's up to all people who care about, you know, about basic human rights to create the change that we want to see. I think that I would completely echo the point that you were making, Nadia and Rabea, about the importance of what happens on the ground. I mean, the only reason that we saw that American public opinion, public discourse had shifted this spring was because of what Palestinians did on the ground. So unless Palestinians on the ground essentially put this issue on the proverbial front page, there's not very much for their supporters in the United States. There's much less energy that can be produced in the United States in solidarity because Americans will just focus on other things. And goodness knows we have a lot of our own problems. So I think that, you know, one of the critical, I think if you look at South Africa and you look at the evolution of the anti-apartheid movement in the United States, what was absolutely critical was that starting in the 1980s, the United Democratic Front, the ANC's essentially local analog, basically had an uprising that started during the period of the state of emergency in South Africa in the 1980s that made South Africa a dominant issue of concern in the United States, that the anti-apartheid movement could then play off of that. So one of I think the things that's really standing in the way of this shift is the existence of the Palestinian Authority as it functions today. Because the Palestinian Authority is preventing that from happening in the West Bank. I mean, maybe it's not surprising that it happened particularly in East Jerusalem, where the Israeli government doesn't allow the PA to function. But if it can't happen in the West Bank, then it seems to me you can't create the focus that needs to happen in the United States so more people can rally around this. There are a lot of people with kind of latent progressive views on this in the United States, but they're not going to prioritize and organize around the issue unless they feel like they're doing so in solidarity with things that they're seeing on the ground.
Absolutely, and I agree. We should be speaking more about to distinguish the activism that we've seen in the last events from the Palestinian official leadership, particularly the Palestinian Authority, but also in Palestinian Citizens of Israel. We've seen people like the Islamic Party that joined the Israeli government most recently, in light or after following the events that unfolded in 48 with Palestinian citizens of Israel. So that's definitely interesting dynamics that are happening there. Talking about apartheid, Peter, I want to actually start with you with another question. You know, we're talking about shift change. We have seen the last few months, I believe it's been a year now, but perhaps a little bit less. We've seen two major reports, one by Human Rights Watch and the other by B'Tselem, which is an Israeli human rights organization, that accused Israel of committing the crime of apartheid. And these reports have echoed what Palestinians have been saying for years. So this is not a new, accusation. In fact, there has also been a UN report that accuse Israel of apartheid before. Still, the title of the Human Rights Watch report, for example, is a threshold crossed. And it suggests that the present reality has shifted in a way that finally justifies using the word apartheid in the Israeli context. To what extent do you think that the nature of the Israeli regime itself has actually changed in recent years? Or has there really been a threshold crossed? Or is it more accurate to describe the Israeli project as an ongoing Nakba since its inception? So there is perhaps a very subtle tension here between endorsing this narrative that says that there is a threshold crossed, and perhaps understanding it as Israel as such has a very problematic foundation that regardless of whether there is a time, temporal moment where we can say that it crossed something. So what is your thoughts about that?
I mean, I think you're right that there is a difference in perspective. That a group like B'Tselem or Human Rights Watch did not start from the perspective that Israel inside the Green Line was necessarily illegitimate. They were willing to entertain the kind of the two-state paradigm for a certain period of time, in which they would have said, well, the Palestinians will get their state. Sure, we will recognize that Israel inside the Green Line still has structural discrimination, et cetera, but we can accept that paradigm and make it, therefore, kind of make a distinction between Israel inside the Green Line and Israel beyond the Green Line. I think that whether one agrees with that or not, I think that was the dominant, that was the kind of dominant perception, more so than there was in Palestinian circles, perhaps. But I think that what happened was the evident, demise of any modicum of prospect for the creation of a sovereign, viable Palestinian state. The fact that you had an Israeli government that for a decade was not even in theory, not even paying lip service to the idea that it supported one, that settlement growth was continuing, essentially made it impossible for a group like B'Tselem and Human Rights Watch to use that paradigm as a way of saying, well, we can look at Israel as essentially these two different entities, a kind of a bad Israel and a good Israel, right? And in this way, essentially, it was the Israeli government and their supporters whose own actions, I think, essentially kind of pulled the rug out from people who might have been essentially willing to accept a kind of a two-state, even kind of liberal Zionist position. But the Israeli government's policies essentially made that just impossible to sustain, which is, I think, what pushed ultimately, again, B'Tselem and Human Rights Watch to make this move. And as you say, on the one hand, it's unfortunate that it takes an Israeli or an American or a kind of global organization to kind of ratify what Palestinians have already been saying. That speaks to the kind of the hierarchy of voices that still tends to exist in this conversation. On the other hand, I think it has helped to normalize those terms to some degree on the progressive side, because when people say, B'Tselem and Human Rights Watch, it's a little bit harder to call B'Tselem an anti-Semitic organization, although certainly some people have tried. And so I think it has made the term a little bit more, it has given it a little more currency in the US than it did before.
Gilbert, Nadia, would you like to jump in on this?
Yeah, I can. Well, I think that what Peter mentioned is worth considering. If a threshold has been passed, it's for liberal Zionism. I don't think that a threshold has been passed from the Palestinian point of view, where things have been deteriorating constantly since the creation of the Israeli state. And in that regard, yes, the Nakba is an ongoing process that starts in 47, 48, but is still carrying on and even worsening in several respects. The first analogies with apartheid were drawn from the Palestinian side even before 1967. Because when liberal Zionists refer to apartheid, they think of the occupied territories, the 1967 occupied territories, right? But this analogy you can find in the you can find a book from the PLO Research Center from the early 60s about this analogy between South African apartheid and the Israeli state, and it's about the condition of the Palestinian citizens in Israel. Because apartheid is not only about townships and Bantustans, it's also about the discrimination, the institutionalized discrimination, and that is it's institutional. It's congenital to the Israeli state. It was born with the Zionist structure of the Israeli state. So yes, there has been a threshold crossed under Netanyahu for liberal Zionism. Liberal Zionism lost hope, if you want, and then resorted to that term. It's the same way that the argument used against the drift towards annexation for those who defend the two-state, the liberal Zionists who defend the two-state perspective. The key argument is that we are going to lose our democratic character if we annex those territories. And since the Netanyahu government went very, very far in that direction and was also encouraged by the Trump administration to do that with the ridiculous so-called peace plan devised by Jared Kushner in that regard, allowing for the whole the annexation of most of the West Bank. Well, that was the threshold that has been crossed, and that made them use the term, again, with the argument always that it's either apartheid or the Jewish democratic state coexisting with an so-called independent Palestinian state. So we're still in this frame of mind, which is something that is, of course, from the Palestinian point of view, the view is quite different.
But can I just add, I think that I agree with all of that, but I also think it's worth noting that it's also Palestinian leadership that has sustained this liberal, quote unquote, liberal Zionist perspective, right? It's the fact that you have a Palestinian leadership that essentially said, we support the idea of two states, that even the Palestinian leadership, politicians inside Israel essentially support the idea of two states. Now, whether they really want a Jewish state inside the Green Line or not is a separate question, but essentially I will just say, is for myself, as someone who's arguing for one state, one of the responses that I hear most consistently inside the American Jewish community is essentially, you're more Catholic than the Pope. This is not what Ayman Odeh says he wants. This is not what, this is, let alone Mahmoud Abbas. Right. So I think that's also been, I think that's another thing which has sustained this discourse, which I agree is clearly eroding and should erode.
Yeah, can I, first of all, yeah, I fully agree with you, Peter. PA, Palestinian Authority, and the Palestinian leadership is totally detached from what is going on the ground. I am talking about Palestinian, by the way, when I talk about Palestinian resistance, I mean people, because as you know, PA is not resisting. On the contrary, it's perpetuating Israeli policies. But what I want to say is that if we want to understand whether this is an ongoing or something has changed in Israeli policies, we need to look at the Zionist ideology. The Zionist ideology, which is the core of the state of Israel. And there's no time to talk about this, but I don't see a difference, between liberal Zionists and the revisionists. They are both expansionists, and there's no difference between hawks and doves. This, unfortunately, we believed in it for some time, thinking that, the revisionists are different, but during Oslo agreement, during Oslo negotiations, 23% Israeli settlements increased according to Peace Now report. That's during negotiation. Immediately after 1967, you probably all know what Eshkol said. We had a nice, what was it? A nice dowry, but we have a bride with it, and we don't want the bride. We don't want the people. Immediately after 67, there was a loan plan that is Israel working on right now, because it's the same as the deal of the century. This is besides what happened immediately after Nakba, when Palestinians were under military rule until 66, just 1 year before 67. It's all calculated. So no, there's no difference. I mean, this is an ongoing, I don't know how they have crossed that threshold. And this has been, as Jalbert just said, it is, for us, it is ongoing.
Thank you, Nadia. I just want to say a couple of brief remarks on this. Precisely on the apartheid analogy, Palestinian citizens of Israel, for those of you who don't know, have been subject to military rule up until 1966. Legally speaking, this rule was imposed through the executive power, so there is no law that we can actually find on the books that says that there was a military rule imposed up until 1966. And this is perhaps contrasted with the shift we're seeing in Israeli legislative trends, that we're seeing the nation state law, the affirmation of more nationalistic legislation under the right wing versus the liberal Zionist kind of associative governments. But both of you, I mean, all of you have noted this. What we have seen is also recently with the Israeli government indicates that the distinctions between Israeli left and right with regards to Palestinians at least have become less and less important as the left, what so-called Israeli left, has joined forces with the revisionist right, or more right-wing than Netanyahu right, in forming the new government. It is also interesting to note that, yes, Palestinians have been also, Palestinian leadership has partly been complicit in this, whether the PA or Palestinian citizens of Israel who've for the first time joined independently the Israeli government. So there is a lot to unpack here for sure, and there is this conversation can go on for much more than that. I want to move on to talking a little bit about the penalizing the Palestinian voices and the charges of anti-Semitism in this context. You know, one of the remarkable changes we've seen during the recent event is not only the rise of a new generation of Palestinians, but also the mainstreaming of perhaps an apologetic discourse that is not hesitant to call Israeli settler colonialism and ethnic cleansing for what it is. We have seen this on both traditional and social media platforms, but we have also seen efforts to penalize these voices under the pretext of hate speech and anti-Semitism. The New York Times has published, for example, an advertisement targeting superstars such as Dua Lipa and the Hadid sisters, accusing them of anti-Semitism. Social media platforms have also been widely complicit in silencing Palestinian voices. And many reports have raised claims against widespread censorship and shadow banning of Palestinian voices. Why do you think people who speak for Palestine are penalized? To begin with, what would you say about anti-Semitism charges against Palestinian people who criticize Israel, and what can we do about it?
Can I say something briefly? I mean, first of all, it's not new. I mean, Palestinian resistance and struggle and resistance around the world that supports Palestinians have always been penalized. It's not new. As forms developed and we started to use different forms, also penalizing these forms took different shapes and forms. Look, to acknowledge that, I mean, to leave resistance, not punishing resistance, it means that Israel is going to acknowledge, okay, so there is something wrong. And if there is something wrong, I have to address this, what is going wrong. And to address what is going wrong, it means I have to give up land. And I don't want to give up land. So to keep the colonial project ongoing, then I would deny that there is something wrong. I have to prove that these activists are totally wrong and they just hate Israel. They hate Jews. I mean, recently, by the way, in Jerusalem, arresting young Palestinians, one of them was my nephew. He was beaten up in the police station. He was not, he did not stay in prison, but he was interrogated. They ask them immediately when they see them, why do you hate Jews? why do you hate Jews? And all of them, they say, we don't. This is not our problem, you see? So I think this is what is going on. But also, activists are not deterred by this. And I see that some of them, of course, some of them I know deleted messages, but others, they just carried on and moved forward.
Thank you, Nadia. Peter, Gilbert, would you like to jump in on this?
Yeah, maybe Peter first.
Peter, I want to actually ask you to also say something about the recent article you said that there is, we need to start talking about anti-Palestinian hate and whether to term it.
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, look, it's not for me to determine what the course of the Palestinian struggle is, but it does seem to me that in the United States, we see this dramatic asymmetry in which there's a constant conversation about whether things are anti-Semitic or not. Most recently is Ben & Jerry's, anti-Semitic for selling products in the occupied territories, but nobody ever asks, well, is it anti-Palestinian to do business in the occupied territories, a place where Palestinians and Jews live under a different legal system, and Palestinians don't have citizenship in the country in which they live. And so my article was an attempt to actually ask the question to make the argument that essentially the reason we have no discourse of anti-Palestinianism in the US is that it's very hard to name things when they're so ubiquitous that they're simply the norm. And when there's no expectation that people should be treated equally, it's not considered bigotry to not treat them equally. I think, so I think that we have a long way to go in this. In terms of the discourse of anti-Semitism, I mean, I totally agree with Nadia. This term, the new anti-Semitism, which is essentially the idea of anti-Semitism that's directed at Israel and Zionism, really comes from the 1970s, at least in the United States, in the American Jewish organizations. It's been a very big focus since then. And it is, I think, used in very cynical and destructive ways, and is partly, I think, just blatantly cynical because it's a way of basically delegitimizing Palestinians and preventing them from being part of the conversation. I think it also is a kind of a weaponization of a certain, maybe you could say, exploitation and weaponization of a certain, I would say, deep tradition in Jewish culture, if this even makes sense, which is to say, especially given that there's very little interaction between most of the people making these accusations and actual Palestinians, right? So they're engaged in a dehumanizing discourse without even often realizing they're engaged in a dehumanizing discourse. But it also, I think, there is this idea deep in Jewish tradition that essentially that the Jewish people are always imperiled or threatened by a successive adversaries, right? I mean, you can even find a text. The tradition starts with essentially the figure of Esau, goes to Amalek, to Haman, and then of course, in medieval Europe, and then the Nazis and the Holocaust. So there is, if you have no interaction with Palestinians, and Palestinians are a faceless mass, there is this tendency to essentially see Palestinians as simply the next iteration in this line of Jew haters, right? That comes in certain ways out of the way that Jews have historically spoken. And the way that tends to break apart when you actually see that Palestinians are not responding out of hatred to Jews for the most part, they're responding out of the fact that they want basic rights and they're being denied basic rights by a Jewish state, right? I don't think Palestinians would be responding all that differently if they were being denied basic, human rights by a state that was not a Jewish state, right? Any state that denies your rights, you're going to be agitating against it. But I think that because at least in the United States, the mainstream American Jewish conversation is largely hermetically sealed off from Palestinians. People don't read books by Palestinians. They don't hear from Palestinian speakers. That is not challenged. And the last thing I will say, and this is, I think, in some ways the most tricky part, is that although I think the Palestinian leadership, as I see it, Palestinian activists have been very strong and clear in denouncing anti-Semitism, and that anti-Semitism is massively weaponized, it probably is also the case that there are increasing episodes of anti-Semitism. certainly from the white nationalist right, but there's also some evidence that when there is increased violence in Israel-Palestine, it does tend to correlate with an increase in real anti-Semitic, not the bullshit anti-Semitic, claimed anti-Semitic, but actually real anti-Semitic incidents in the US and Europe. There seems to be some data on that. And the reasons for that one could get into, but again, especially in the age of social media, it only takes a couple of incidents of someone being punched by someone who claims to be part of some Palestinian freedom protest or whatever, for that to be what obsesses people and activates these fears that exist within the Jewish experience and then get weaponized by Jewish leadership.
Yeah, but may I? Yeah.
Absolutely. Go ahead.
Yes. Well, I think it needs a closer also examination of what is labeled as anti-Semitic acts, you know. I'm not sure that all of them are really anti-Semitic acts, what you and me would completely agree on defining as anti-Semitic act, because the tendency to conflate criticism of Israel with anti-Semitism is very strong. And it's not only a matter of how it is perceived among Jews that Peter, you have been addressing. The problem is that this argument and this accusation of anti-Semitism is used by every kind of sphere in the Western world against the pro-Palestinian struggle. It's not only Jews that are using this accusation of anti-Semitism. Take the UK, for instance, the Boris Johnson government, his Minister of Education and all that have been trying to impose the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism, which includes a conflation between anti-Semitism and the criticism of Israel as illustrative examples. They have tried to impose that on the academia, for instance, in the UK. In France, we have seen even the French president making some statements going in that direction. The French parliament voted a ridiculous, well, with a massive abstention. People cowered out of the vote, but it was voted on, the same kind of thing. Germany, where I'm speaking from, has a lot to say on that. And behind this, you have, of course, you use two terms, the weaponization and instrumentalization. Yes, we have the weaponization and instrumentalization of the Holocaust, of the Nazi genocide of the Jews. And that has been, from the very beginning of the State of Israel, a major propaganda tool, a major argument used by the Israeli state from the beginning. The Palestinians were portrayed as continuator of Nazism through the figure of Amin al-Husseini, the famous Mufti of Jerusalem, about whom there is much more in anti-Palestinian circles than in Palestinian circles. There is much less discussion of this person there. This instrumentalization have been there, and it leads to this. Of course, this is one of the peculiarities. That is, we have a state, a settler colonial state, but the settlers of the settler colonial state, a big part of them relate to this history of genocide. Okay, this is a specificity. But that leads to this very bizarre thing. Can you imagine 1 second as a major argument against the ANC struggle in South Africa that they are anti-white racist? I mean, no one would have bought such an argument. It wouldn't have flown. But it can be effective against the Palestinian struggle because of the Holocaust, because of this memory, because of this tradition that is exploited, over-exploited, over-instrumentalized by the Israeli state to the point, reached by Netanyahu, of exonerating Hitler from the genocide to put the blame on Amin al-Husseini, which was, of course, absolutely grotesque. So yes, that's the issue we have. And you're right that I always say the same as you were saying, maybe we say it in different terms, but the pro-Palestinian struggle should turn the table. Instead of being defensive, no, we're not anti-Semitic. The situation should be reversed. You are anti-Arab, you are anti-Palestinian. Racism is on the other side. It's not the racism of the oppressed, It's not the oppressed that are the racists here. It's the oppressor that is the racist. And whatever expressions of resentment you may see on the side of the oppressed, some of them very regrettable, of course, but these are primarily results of oppression. And that's the key point here. This distinction between oppressed and oppressor remains decisive, and what Israel, the pro-Israel camp tries to blur by the resort to the Holocaust and anti-Semitism as argument is precisely this basic distinction.
I have something to add, but I'm conscious that Nadia hasn't spoken for a while, so
I just want to add perhaps
No,
to this.
go ahead, Peter. I have nothing to add.
I just want to jump in and give two brief comments on this. Perhaps some of you followed, but recently Yair Lapid, who is the alternate Prime Minister of Israel right now, he has commented on anti-Semitism, saying that in his eyes, basically all forms of racism are anti-Semitic, and he's been widely criticized within Israeli circles on that. So there is this tension even within Israel of how to levy anti-Semitic claims or charges, and whether to keep anti-Semitic very specified or to broaden it as or frame it as part of a larger structures. This is exactly, Gilbert, what you were saying about, whether we perceive this as part of who is the oppressor or oppressed. But I also want to say something about how, perhaps from my experience, the national consciousness of many Israelis is to extend this sense of being oppressed, even when they're in positions of power in Israel and dominating Palestinians. So this is really, and we have seen it really, really with Palestinian citizens of Israel, like my family, like myself, in the recent events in May, people were being lynched in the street, and there is obviously, violence by Palestinians as well during these times. But the role of the, you can't just ignore the role of the state in all of this, and that was backing up settlers and Jewish supremacist mobs who were attacking Palestinians, etc., etc. But still, the framing, even by the highest ranks of public opinion, was that there is pogroms against Jews as such, and you see it also in court decisions. Right, like we're still in the aftermath of all what is happening. Many people think we're done. We're absolutely not done. As I work also in Adala, we're seeing the consequences, the legal consequences of all what's happening. There is dozens of cases still pending in courts, mostly against Palestinians. Very few cases against Jewish Israelis that use the term, the legal provisions of racism, as if this was racist attacks. And this is something to note. I've always thought about it in the sense of, like the legal consciousness can't come to terms with perceiving Jewish Israelis as nothing else but an extension of this oppressed consciousness. So I just wanted to say that there is, if you guys want to go on with this debate, we still have the time to do that for a few more minutes. I just want to say that there is a question on the UK in this context, and the purge of the left in the Labour Party is intensifying, according to the question. In my opinion, the political weakness of Corbyn is in not facing the Zionist assault determinedly has enabled this. And if you want to say something about that as we move on, just a couple of sentences if you want to wrap up your thoughts on this.
Oh, I thought Peter wanted to add something on.
I recognize that it is perhaps an unfair burden to place upon a group of people who are oppressed and lack basic rights to be in a position of having to reassure their oppressors. But it also seems to me that, again, I think about what the ANC was able to do, that stressing a vision that rejects all forms of bigotry, including anti-Semitism, even as, while I totally agree with Gilbert, it's emphasizing that we need to have a discourse about anti-Palestinian bigotry and racism, which we don't, I think is crucial. And that's why and I'm just talking for someone who lives inside the Jewish community in the United States and here's the way things respond. When people, when you can't have a conversation for 3 minutes about any of this in the Jewish community without referring to the Hamas charter, the first Hamas charter, right? When Palestinians respond by saying it's irrelevant, that, in my experience, to Jewish ears is less effective than saying, yes, it was anti-Semitic, and it was wrong to be anti-Semitic, right? And I wish it not had taken them till 2017 to revise it, right? It's an acknowledgement of, because Jews are, whatever the similarities between Israel and South Africa, the historical experience of Jews and Afrikaners is quite different, right? The Afrikaners did not experience a genocide. And the last point I will make, and this is another area, it's not just and again, I'm not saying anything probably people here don't know, but the discourse is not only about the Holocaust. The discourse is very much about a very particular discourse about the experience of the Jews from Arab lands, which unfortunately is often sustained by Jews from Arab lands, right? Who will often tell this story for complicated reasons about themselves. Jews can never be safe under Arab majority rule, right? It's not bad. It's not only that you hear that from Ashkenazi Jews, you hear that from Jews who come from the Middle East themselves. And that discourse, it seems to me, also is really crucial to challenging that discourse. It seems to me is really important in changing this whole conversation. And I recognize that it's not fair to put that burden on Palestinians. It's partly what we Jews ourselves must do, but I think that it's for all of us to do together.
Yeah. I really want to say something about this. Have you? I'm sure you've seen Likud charter as well.
Yes. Yes.
So I mean, the problem is Israel deals with the Palestinian Authority that works against Palestinians and works with Israel and is rejected, right? So I mean, and there are back channels, by the way, in negotiations between Hamas and Israel. And this leads me to a question, by the way, in the chat about Gaza and whether U.S. There is a change in U.S. position about Gaza. I mean, the whole issue of Gaza is about divide and rule, and Netanyahu himself, when there was a step towards reconciliation, immediately, although peace process has been frozen and nothing was moving, immediately he responded and telling Mahmoud Abbas, you have to choose between negotiation or reconciliation with Gaza. So Gaza, I mean, there will be no position from US because for US, it's under terrorist rule, so they wouldn't dare say something about Gaza. The other thing is about, you mentioned about Israeli Arabs. I don't know, I mean, I'm sure that there is some kind of a focus from Israel on those who would say, oh, it was terrible in the Arab countries we lived. But no, I've read accounts from, and I have friends, by the way, we have friends from Arab countries who lived and did not want to leave, even because they were not discriminated against. I understand that the rise of nationalism and besides the establishment of Israel changed things. But no, they have lived racism, they experienced racism in Israel. And I've read about their accounts and how Israel discriminated against Arab Israelis because they are Arab. And there are quotes from Golda Meir, from Ben Gurion, that they lack ego, that thank God there's nothing similar between us and those Arab Jews. So no, I mean, that's all what I want to say. So, sorry.
Yeah, I mean, comment on this. The argument about the Jews in Arab countries is hardly used in Western countries. It's used by the Zionists generally, and that's true. But Western governments and all that, they don't refer to that. And actually, they don't want to spoil their relations with Arab governments. They have very close relations with Arab governments, right? So that's not their argument. The argument is a reference to the Holocaust, which is the genocide of Jews in Europe, not in the Arab lands. And well, everyone knows from history that when the Jews had to flee persecution in Spain, they went to Muslim the territories of the Ottoman Empire. So
well, they also suffered persecution in Muslim Spain as well.
They suffered persecution like other minorities, not only Jews, Christians too, and that's the Middle Ages. If you go to that kind of societies, where just show me one in Europe where you didn't have persecution. So, I mean, these are unhistorical arguments, completely unhistorical arguments, of course. And I think it's easy to face them. But the issue is that the argument, I mean, when you're absolutely right to say that, I mean, we should speak justice and we should reject any form of racism, and anti-Semitism is definitely one form and one very important form of racism, no doubt about that. But frankly, do you think the Palestinians have not done so? I mean, they have been doing that for decades. For decades, they have been, I mean, of course, which Palestinians is the same question as which Jews we are speaking about. Yeah, you have one section of fascists in Israel, one fascist wing of Zionism. So if I want to take that as the reference point, then the discussion is closed. There's no possible discussion. So you have a whole range. And it's the same with the Palestinians and the Arabs. You find among Palestinians, you find among Arabs statements of Holocaust denial, statements that you can define or describe as anti-Semitic and the rest. But you also find a lot of people fighting against that, you know, and then you have also the difference in the meaning of it, because as I said, and that irritates a lot of people when I say it, but even if you had racism on both sides, the racism of the oppressed is a reaction to the racism of the oppressor. We have to keep that in mind. That is, any anti-Jewish statements you may find among Palestinians, you know, are a result of the structural oppression and the daily oppression that Palestinians are suffering at the hands of the Israeli state. This is not like the anti-Semitism of someone in Germany or Holocaust denial by a German or an Austrian or a French or whatever it is, or an American for that matter. So there's a very, very, very big difference here. The relation to the Holocaust by those who belong to populations that historically have perpetrated the Holocaust is not the same as Palestinians who bear no responsibility whatsoever in the Holocaust, despite all the attempts by the Zionist propaganda to say the contrary. So that's the point here. The issue is that this is used as an instrument, this is instrumentalized, this is weaponized, and it's not for the lack of rejection of anti-Semitism on the Palestinian side that it is there. It will be the same. You know, we issued a statement signed by 122 academics, Palestinians and Arab academics, about the IHRA statement. And this is hardly taken into account, as if, you know, we have no voice on that. So you have discussions between people, and any statement signed by Jewish academics is given much more importance than anything Arab and Palestinian academics do. So that's in this statement, we have very strong terms about anti-Semitism, yeah? But that's the point. The other side doesn't want to listen to that. It's just a weaponization of the Holocaust, of anti-Semitism, which are, I mean, we don't need to say how horrible the events they are, but we have to keep in mind that they are here being used, they are misused completely. And Rabia gave, I mean, what happened to the Palestinian citizens of Israel last May, you know, this, I mean, if you had to make an analogy, and that analogy was made in the United States, it would have been with the, you know, the events after the murder of George Floyd, and the beginning of riots, and then what remained. So that's what you had after the initial events in Jerusalem and blood and Lidda and blood, and the president of the Israeli state called that pogroms. I mean, this is just reversing completely the reality. Here, the oppressor is accusing the oppressed of being the oppressor. This is just grotesque.
Thank you, Zubair. I think this debate is really interesting for all of us, and we can all agree that anti-Semitism is bad. The question becomes more, I think, about who has the responsibility. And I think that I sometimes wonder about this, like why we Palestinians many times have to actually reaffirm and remind the world that we are maintaining this distinction between Zionism and Jews, while the Israeli government and I mean, obviously about more progressive Jewish people are also trying to emphasize this, but Palestinian or pro-Palestinian voices are the ones who are bearing this struggle to distinguish between Jewish and Judaism and Zionism. So this is interesting, you know, leading up to this concluding remarks, whether Zionism itself is anti-Semitic. And this has a rich history dating back to the Nazi Germany, obviously, and the interest of Zionism in settling in Palestine, with agreements with Nazi Germany as well to transfer the transfer agreement between Nazi Germany and the Zionist movement. But we don't have time to delve into that, unfortunately. We can all agree right now about the importance of this debate. I want to really, we're just beyond, we have to close. So maybe perhaps in a couple sentences, each of you guys, if you want to wrap up and talk a little bit about the future, where do we see this heading? Some sort of combination of hope, pessimism, optimism, and whether we see, you know, tying it back to the role of governments. On one hand, we're seeing the Biden administration basically didn't do anything. It even had a hard time to condemn the killing of children, as we've seen in Gaza. On the other hand, perhaps some other governments were more vocal, like the Irish government. We're seeing the role of BDS coming back to the center stage about debates with the recent Ben and Jerry's. So if you have any thoughts about that, very, very briefly, we'd love to hear before closing. Thank you.
I mean, I just want to say that as a Palestinian, I mean, sometimes of course, I can't lose hope. And as Peter said, there is a difference between hope and optimism. But I must admit that for me, sometimes I feel some kind of hopelessness. But other times I feel, no, I shouldn't give up, and here's something changing. I mean, most Palestinians, I think, feel the same. However, what I want to say is that definitely the latest events in May have changed something. There's something that changed. I think that for the time being, what I can pinpoint that change as being more confident in talking about the definition of anti-Semitism, defying Israeli discourse of peace, and trying to explain the real meaning of peace for Palestinians. Definitely this gave Palestinians more confidence to come forward and talk about it than pre-May events. And thank you very much for the event. Thank you.
Thank you, Nadia. Peter, you want to go ahead?
Sure. I'll just say two quick things. The first is to respond to what Gilbert just said. I just wanted to say, I recognize how frustrating it must be to have to write a letter saying you're not anti-Semitic when you know you're not anti-Semitic. And I recognize it must be even more frustrating to have people not pay attention to that letter. But I will just say, those letters matter to me. They have an impact on me, and they have an impact on people like me, because we were raised in Jewish homes, just like everybody else by and large, that were consumed with fear, and where the fear was exploited, and where there was no understanding of Palestinians except for generally the latest iteration in the series of threats to the Jewish people. So those letters for us matter. Even if they don't matter to all the people who are too disingenuous or too cut off to listen to them. The second point I would make is that while I may have sounded pessimistic, I will say one thing. I'll tell a story. I wrote an op-ed long before Ben and Jerry's, although long after many Palestinians, of course, suggesting that people not buy products from the settlements. And after I wrote that op-ed, I was contacted by somebody who works for an American Jewish organization. That person's job is to fight against BDS. That was their job. And the person wanted to talk to me. And in the middle of the conversation, the person said to me, you know, I don't buy products from the settlements. This person's job was to fight against BDS, which is just a small illustration of saying, I can't speak as much for inside Israel, but inside the American Jewish establishment, there are more people than you might imagine who are inside those institutions who don't actually believe it. It's a job for them, or maybe there's fear about how they'll perceive because they know there's a cost. But in some ways, that citadel of power, the closer to it you are, it actually doesn't, you can see more cracks than you can see from a distance. I've seen some of those cracks myself from the inside, and I think that's another source of hope.
Thank you, Peter. Gilbert?
Yeah, thank you, Peter, for what you said. And be assured that we know that what we are doing matters to people like you, and that's the main reason why we do it in the first place. Otherwise, indeed, the incentive to do something would be limited. And the second point I want to say in conclusion relates also to what you have been saying from the start. I think that for structural reasons, the Palestinian struggle depends in the long run on two main issues. What happened within the Israeli Jewish society and what happens in the United States as the main sponsor of the Israeli state. These are two very important determinants here. And I think that the role of people like you, Peter, and I have to salute the very courageous statements and positions you have been taking recently, but I think this is a great help for the Palestinian struggle. So I wanted to finish on this note of thanks.
Great, thank you, everybody. I want to thank everybody who attended and participated in this event. Whitney, if you want to jump in and tell us more about how to contribute to the American Friends of SOAS, there is a link in the chat that is just Whitney just put there. So feel free to go in and donate for that. That's it on my end. Thank you, everybody, for participating.
Yes, thank you so much, Rabia. And I just wanted to say on behalf of the American Friends of SOAS board directors and the alumni community here in the US, I want to say thank you so much to our panelists. Thank you, Professor Eshkar, Professor Najjar, Professor Peter Beinart, for your really insightful discussion and your brave insights and honesty, and also to Rabia for serving as an excellent moderator today. And I'd also like to thank Shireen Nassar and Bharti Kansara for co-organizing today's event. I really appreciate all of the effort that's gone into it. And yeah, as Rabia mentioned, if you enjoyed the discussion today, we appeal to all of you to make a contribution, no matter large or small, in support of exceptional academics offered at SOAS. As we know, there's nowhere like SOAS and the academics that inhabit it. So we really want to support them. And alternatively, as the Association of SOAS Alumni here in the US, AFSOAS offers one scholarship annually to an American student in financial need to study full-time one-year top master's program at SOAS in London. So to date, there have been 7 of these scholarship recipients, and we would so appreciate your support of this initiative. I think if you click the link below, you can kind of choose where you want your donation money to go to. So that's called the John Loyello Scholarship Fund if you're interested. And you can make a tax-deductible contribution on the website at afsoas.org/donate, and then earmark your gift as you see fit. So again, thank you today to all of our panelists, to our incredible moderator. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon, and I wish everybody a wonderful day. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Bye-bye.
Thank you.